Coogs House. College basketball is getting shaken up, including the back-to-back champs, all by the City of Angels. How that impacts Houston and the Big 12.
You are Locked On Cougs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Cougs, today the podcast all about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach Parker Ainsworth. And whether you're a Houston fan or just a hater who came to stop by, thank you for making Locked On Cougs your first listen of the day. If you want to join the conversation but don't know what to say, tell us in the comments down below, wherever you found this podcast, what flavor wing sauce or rub you go with. I like lemon pepper, but I started finding lemon pepper sauce. So that changes things up sometimes. It's usually dry rub and something. Anyway, it gets complicated way too complicated. I care way too much about that one, actually. Today's show is brought to you by eBay Motors. More on that fun in a minute. We got a lot of things to talk about, including more on the softball story we're continuing to keep tabs on here at Locked On Cougs each day. We also want to talk some about the biggest story in college basketball right now, obviously pertaining to Houston as a college basketball power these days. I want to talk some about how the story ends up impacting potential rosters at Houston and around Houston very, very specifically. Yes, I'm talking about the UConn Huskies and Coach Dan Hurley. Now, if you're not in the national news or not paying attention to sports at the national level, this may seem like a shock, but UConn Huskies, after winning back-to-back national championships, may be about to lose their coach to the Los Angeles Lakers. Hurley, for what it's worth, has been on the record very publicly about not wanting to leave UConn for just any job. He apparently had offers to come to get the Kentucky job when that whole thing spiraled and changed and whatever. But obviously the Lakers is not a college job. It's a pro job. And I think that there's some part of each coach that wants to be coaching with the best. I mean, Sampson coached in at an assistant level in the NBA for a while before coming back to college, right? I think we understand that some people want to test the waters out there. This is a show that focuses on Houston and the Houston perspective, but I do want to dive into what that type of movement could mean for the Houston Cougars. And at the coaching staff level, I think it's fascinating because truthfully, UConn has a couple of options if Danny Hurley leaves. He probably it's going to take someone with him from the assistant coaching staff or the assistant coaches there on staff. Would make sense. You wouldn't just take the Laker job and not be able to bring any of your guys with you. He's got a couple of high-end assistants, highly touted assistants there, and Luke Murray and Kamani Young. Luke Murray is kind of considered the X's and O's guy. Kamani Young is considered the recruiter. In the draft process, Alex Karaban, who actually pulled out of the draft, we'll talk more about him later, in the draft process said he was quoted as saying that he felt like the trio of them were head coaches, which is interesting now that we're in the situation we're in now, where theoretically the last one of those three left standing is the next head coach. Maybe we'll see. Also, though, UConn is a basketball program with the kind of cash to not have to settle for an interim internal candidate and thus look around. Now, I do think we probably need to mention here that that probably means you'll hear Kelvin and Kellen both mentioned if the spot's available. I don't think either one is going anywhere, but you're going to hear it put out there, right? I will say that I think Casey Beard and Quantus White will both be head coaches in Division I college basketball in the near future. I don't think UConn's the gig. Casey's had an incredible rise from a video guy all the way up to like an associate head coach and a lead assistant at Houston, right? Quantus has a basketball mind, led a big-time AAU program, assistant coach a couple different D1 programs. He's going to get his shot too. I just feel like UConn's probably looking, unlike Casey or Quantus, going to be looking for somebody with head coaching Division I experience. They're that kind of a brand, right? So I feel fairly safe that they're not peeling directly out of Houston because the only person they'd be interested in is Kelvin, and I don't think he's uprooting his entire system to go to Connecticut. I just don't see it happening, frankly. Just don't. But what I do think is interesting is the cycle that this could start if you kind of went external here would not be unlike we saw happen, frankly, at SMU, right? SMU fires Rob Lanier. People are like, kind of like, why? Like, what'd you expect? He goes and gets a job right away at Rice, which tells you a lot about, like, okay, SMU and Rice were both in the American Athletic Conference. Rice took the coach as soon as you fired him. Maybe it wasn't the right firing. And then also, SMU, their coach, they then get the former USC coach. USC gets the former Arkansas coach. Arkansas gets Coach Cal from Kentucky. Kentucky gets Mark Pope. Pope is at BYU, and now there's no BYU there, so they pull in an assistant off the Phoenix Sun staff, right? Like that chain of dominoes was crazy. And I think it's unique because the way that pro and college basketball are overlapping and all of this, that you could potentially have that happen again right now. Like, I don't know that the first hire made in the series of dominoes here will impact Houston. But if it ends up like where a spot that would be a great fit for Qantas or KC has an opening suddenly in late June, early July, that'd be a big step up for them and an opportunity they'd probably not be able to turn down. That's how this eventually ties back to Houston, right? The chain of dominoes gets back. Now, again, I think they'll probably go internal if Danny Hurley leaves. It feels more and more likely that he is. By the time you're hearing this on Friday, he might have. But I start with Rutgers. Rutgers is a Power 5 program in the Big Ten. Steve Peichel is their coach. They had a big recruiting class they just signed. And frankly, he's a UConn alum, right? And so bringing in somebody that understands the brand, he did some coaching. I forget if it was grad assistant or assistant coaching there as well. But realistically, he could theoretically make the jump, take his highly recruited kids, because it'd be a step up in basketball program for them. He could make it a going home kind of thing, could save some. Like, there's no real issues to him going there. Then the Rutgers job is open and the domino chain starts, right? On the inverse, they could also go get the last head coach to win back-to-back titles before Bob Hurley. Dan Hurley, not Bob Hurley, and get Billy Donovan. Billy Donovan's coaching in the NBA with Chicago Bulls. Frankly, he was mentioned for some coaching jobs from some of the college jobs. At the last cycle, we saw this happen. The NBA season was not over, so he didn't really didn't put his name fully in or something. Like, the idea of getting him in for interviews was a little more challenging. NBA season certainly over for Chicago at this point. Certainly more time on his hands. Would be an interesting process. In that instance, I don't know that dominoes really get back to Houston or the rest of college. I feel like Chicago probably fills with a guy with pro experience, right? You could talk about Shaka Smart and Marquette leaving, go to UConn, another Big East program, but with more responsibilities or certainly more like eyeballs than Marquette these days. He didn't do so well in the eyeballs in Austin, so maybe not. The only Big 12 guy I could see, honestly, taking the UConn job is Otzelberger from Iowa State. And that's mostly because I think that guy's a heck of a coach, one. Two, I think he's the kind of heck of a coach that understands some schools are basketball schools. Iowa State, while it's had great talent and great teams in the last 25 years, ain't like UConn as far as basketball school goes, right? And I also think that, frankly, the system he runs would thrive with the kind of recruiting that UConn has done in the past, right? And the way that impacts Houston is that ultimately hurts Iowa State. Iowa State, Otzelberger is a great coach, right? And so the idea that they'd be weaker helps Houston. That's a good way these dominoes start, assuming the trail of dominoes that follows at Iowa State doesn't directly impact Houston, right? It is a fun, interesting thought experiment, but truthfully, the next 72 hours are where a lot of these dominoes will fall, right? And so Danny Hurley has reportedly talked to his team there at UConn, saying yes, he is in negotiations, talking through things with LA. He had not taken the job yet, but he is interviewing. He, expressed the idea like this is a dream. Everyone's dream is to go pro. This is kind of the same dream for a coach. Like, try to relate to the kids in some way with all of that. And then they kind of had a summer practice as usual, which is kind of weird. But I do think there's substantial things here. Again, by the time you're hearing this on Friday, he might have already been hired in LA, right? And so the dominoes and the way that affects Houston in terms of coaching is obviously interesting. The more impactful thing, though, maybe in the guys that dribble the ball themselves, the players and the movement there. I want to talk some about that in a second. But first, I want to make sure we talk to you about putting together a great performing team and what that looks like for both the Houston Cougars, for other teams, and of course, with eBay Motors, because passion, drive, and patience are the formula for winning championships, and it's what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level up to peak performance: superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber and not cash. The parts you need and the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Electronics only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, so let's say that Friday morning, much like Thursday morning's Woj Bomb about this, Friday morning's Woj Bomb is the Lakers have hired Dan Hurley, right? A special clock starts then. Per the latest NCAA transfer rules, if a head coach of a program, a Division I program, any sport, changes jobs or leaves the job, so like if the head coach of the, water aerobics team at Houston leaves, right? I'm trying to make up programs to be examples, but let's say the coach leaves on their they're fired, whatever. The coach leaves, not the end of a coach leaves. Okay. A transfer window for the players on the roster opens for 30 days, meaning they have 30 days to decide if they're in or out on whatever happens next. That clock is both for the school to hire a coach to try and recruit the kids to stay, and for the kids to decide what they want to do. Now, UConn, as a back-to-back national champion, as a team that pulls in 4- and 5-star kids all the time, as a high-end basketball program, has a roster full of talented kids from across the nation. A lot of Northeast kids, but from across the nation, right? UConn is kind of unofficially a New York City school in the way that they recruit, but they're also have kids like Liam McNeely from the DFW area, right? So suddenly, it's a feeding frenzy on all of those kids. Now, Houston would have to do some maneuvering to create a roster spot, right? They're already technically over the scholarship limit because J1's COVID year technically doesn't count towards, like, he counts towards a roster spot, but not towards the 13 they have to have because of the pandemic year, right? So they actually technically have more than they can right now, unless, I don't know, let's just say there was a player on the team who came from a lot of money, had a bunch of NIL deals in high school even. Let's just say his dad was like a rapper. Oh, we have one of those. He could afford to pay the tuition theoretically, right? And be a quote air quotes walk on because he had millions of dollars in NIL back from his high school days. That's a rumor circling the internet, but I will say that it would take that type of fine-tuned maneuvering for Houston to create a spot to pull in one of these guys onto their current team. However, you can put every dollar in your bank account that other Big 12 schools are going to be calling these other kids. Alex Karaban was projected to be a late first, early second round pick in the NBA draft this summer. And he pulled his name out of the draft to go back to UConn. he will get a call or a text or an email, whatever you're allowed to send from every program. And I'd include ours in that. Every program in Division One basketball will reach out to Alex Karaban and say, "Hey, if you're interested," right? He's that kind of good, right? For what it's worth, in a Big 12 kind of way, he was really high in Iowa State before committing to UConn, right? Like, what we talked about Otzelberger going there. The kid could also just go to Otzelberger and stay in Iowa State, right? So, like, interesting thing there. Also to the Big 12. Big 12 recruits DFW very hard. I mentioned Liam McNeely. McNeely chose UConn after decommitting from Indiana. He still hasn't played a college game yet. He's a class of 2024 kid. He just got to campus for workouts. Now the coach is gone. Where's he going to go? Right. I think it stands to reason that he would at least enter the transfer portal, reopen his recruitment. And he's been actively recruited as recently as April by a number of programs. Houston was interested in him at one point too, right? Like, where does he end up going? A lot of people before he chose UConn had him crystal balled to Kansas. Kansas is the transfer portal for some wings. Does he still go there and join that roster? I don't know how that works. I do know that he and Rylan Griffin were both in the DFW area around the same time of high school. Didn't play together, but like in the same kind of upper echelon circles. Rylan just went to Kansas from Alabama, right? So who knows how that goes. Solomon Ball, projected to be a big impact player for them next year. Was a high school highly touted recruit in class of 2023. Played off the bench last year as a freshman, right? In Big 12 news, he had Arizona State in his Final Four out of high school, right? Well, Arizona State's now a Big 12 opponent, and suddenly they'd be getting a 4 or 5-star kind of kid into their program because UConn's flushing apart, right? He's a California kid. I don't know if he'd go back to Cali or what, but Arizona State was really high for him. Arizona State was really high for him. The California kid is Aiden Mahaney. Aiden Mahaney was at St. Mary's. Houston played him in a non-conference game in December of 22. It was in Fort Worth, which was kind of neutral, kind of not, right? I thought Mahaney looked good. I mean, he wasn't Jamal Shedd, wasn't Marcus Sasser, but he looked good, right? And so what does that look like? Could be interesting to say the least. Also, and so anyone on UConn's roster could go anywhere and make an impact. They're very, very talented. The bigger impact perhaps for Houston, though, is not just who goes to the conference, but who in their 2025 class or 2026 class is like, well, if Danny Hurley ain't there, I ain't going, right? Because in their 2025 class, for instance, UConn had only offered 5 kids, 3 5-stars, 2 4-stars, right? They only offer the top ends. And for what it's worth, there are a lot of New England kids and Northeast kids up there, right? But one of the ones in that group of 5 that was not, Darius Acuff, the same point guard from IMG Academy that played with Chase McCarty, new current Houston Cougar. He's got a Houston offer, right? You start spinning these wheels and start trying to figure out, wait, what's going on here, right? If he doesn't want to go to UConn, does he want to come play with Buddy Chase again, right? We love a tough, hard-nosed point guard. We know we've got some scoring at other guard spots. Like, what's going? Milos is going to be a senior by Darius's freshman. What's going to happen, right? Also, you start spinning those wheels. All of the player movement after this is both, frankly, something that did not happen not that long ago, and I'd argue is good because it's in the benefit of the players. And if the coach can jump up and take an LA job on a whim, the player should also be able to do what's best for them. That seems fairly obvious in this, right? But also, where these kids end up is going to be a big deal. And so I don't know. I don't know where they land necessarily. I feel confident that McNeely's going to give Kansas a hard look. I feel confident that Iowa State's going to get on the phone with Alex Karaban, right? I feel confident that Acuff's not going to go to UConn if Danny Hurley ain't there, right? Like, I feel confident that these things are going to happen. I can't guarantee it. And I think the stories to follow, if you're trying to follow what the future of Houston Cougar basketball, men's basketball, looks like in the fallout of this, is where those dominoes in terms of the players go, right? We saw when Cal went from Kentucky to Arkansas, he took some of his Kentucky guys with him. And then Kentucky and Mark Pope tried to pull in a handful of different guys. But I don't think that series of dominoes impacted Houston in quite the same way this UConn one will, right? And again, at this point, the moment we're recording this, late on Thursday night, after the NBA Finals, trying to keep it quiet. People are sleeping. I do feel like the trickle down, what snowball, all really does eventually come back to Houston, if not because it directly impacts the roster, because it directly impacts the opponent's rosters. Suddenly there's just 4 and 5 stars out there floating around for everybody to take. Now, I want to talk some in a second about continuing the softball story, just continue to add more context to it. So let's talk about that. All right, so one of the stories I've been following this week at Locked On Cougs, I should remind folks that maybe you're not an everyday or you don't want to admit it yet. You should be. But the other day, Scott and Holman podcast, another Houston Cougar podcast, they put out like a long episode once a week. Cover all things, all kinds of sports. It's a lot of updates on how teams are doing. They kind of broke their own mold the other day and broke a story that had been reported to them. A bunch of players had come to them anonymously from the softball program about some abuses, right? There was allegations of a player carrying a gun in potentially threatening ways and a bunch of spots that, frankly, not supposed to have those. I understand this is a 2A country, right? However, there's certain spots that, like, you take that and you don't take that, right? Like campuses being one of them, right? Again, alleged. You also had allegations of different types of abuse between, like, not allowing players to eat food in facilities when they're in facilities for hours and hours and hours on end. Talking about nutritionists being denied access and things like that. Talk about players and being locked in hotel rooms on the road and not being able to see, like, their families that came to visit and watch them, right? And then just kind of a culture of, like, bullying and violence towards one another and aggravations and things like that. And kind of in tears, that last bit about just being a tough-minded, like, way too much bullying happening kind of culture, I think on its own wouldn't be a big deal. But when you tack it into, and then all these other things, it's like, this is a theme, right? I had 2 players reach out anonymously, 1 parent reach out anonymously at this point. The parent and I are going to be talking on the phone later, hopefully. We're trying to schedule that. And I also saw a public Facebook post from a recently finished player. I think that what's interesting is that these things are being kind of confirmed. I have yet to have anyone be like, anyone within the program be like, "Oh my gosh, Parker, you're so far off. I can't believe you're out here blaspheming, blah, blah, blah." I haven't had that. I frankly would welcome that. Again, as someone who wants the programs to do well, I would like to be told, like, there's things I'm missing, context I'm missing, stories I'm missing that shed some light on the other perspective. Right now, this feels fairly atrocious, right? It feels like the kind of thing where coaches need to be fired. It sounds like, the way I'm hearing it, like things are not great. Right. Confirmations I was able to hear and put out there. I'm not putting people's names on because I told them I wouldn't. And that's the way I'm not a journalist, but I think that's the way you're supposed to do it. Right. Is that players were not allowed to leave facilities. That part I can, say that I heard firsthand from a couple people that, like, they would be traveling to an away game. They'd be like, "Hey, I grew up here. My family's here." Or, "Hey, my family came all this way to visit me and watch me play." And they'd be like, told, "Tough, I don't care how many hours we have in downtime, you're not to leave your room. You have to sit here and focus, in very much you need to sit and think about the game we're about to play kind of way." And, I understand there's some like a level of like focus you do have to have, but also what kind of mind games are you playing where like they can't talk to their families who are downstairs in the hotel? And this is across multiple trips too, it sounds like, right? Like this isn't just a one-time thing. I do also have someone saying, I don't have a person who is in the transfer portal transferring out of Houston saying, so I should preface with that. But someone saying that allegedly the players that are leaving Houston, we have, I think, 4 or 5 left this season and 3 or 4 left after the 2023 season, are doing so because of the coach relationship with the players. I think that speaks volumes. It's a large number of kids leaving each year that can cite that. Again, none of them have come forward and told me that. This is someone speaking on behalf of a former teammate, but I do think that's problematic. And frankly, that's kind of problematic for even if you're like, oh, Parker's being a big wussy about the such and such or whatever, like just as far as performance goes, like you're losing your team every year, like it's not great for performance either, right? Like it's not just about the social emotional health of people playing or whatever. There's also some like hard to have a continuous or any continuity and build anything if you don't have that, right? I was then sent, I think this was actually made sometime in the last week, but I'm putting a name on this one because it was put out on Facebook. Brianna Burton, who was class of 2020, this is a Facebook post that she wrote. Coming on here, Facebook, to say the allegations brought to the softball team are with 100% accuracy. I played there from 2016 to 2020. Number 22, the prime of the program. 2 regionals back-to-back. Parentheses, I didn't play much, but I was there the whole time and traveled every single game and to Mexico included. Close parentheses. I also playing in both regional games. Do not take this lightly. I endured much worse than this, besides the gun allegation which is fact. The toxicity, the pitting girls against each other, the mental abuse caused from weight or nutrition, not to mention forcing players to play through injury, quote, because she did, end quote, or implying there will be consequences. This is finally coming to light, but I was there in 2016 with her first season, Coach Vaselli, with their first season, and you guys would have been appalled at what had occurred then. Please bring to light the situation and get the help the program needs. The constant overturn of coaches and players should tell you everything. Thank you for reading, and I hope all you don't take this lightly or believe. I was there firsthand for 4 years. I know girls still on the team that I played with because of COVID. Please, for the players, please. Again, that's Brianna Burton, class of 2020. I would point out that, again, I'm looking and seeking, and I have not heard a contradictory perspective, right? I have not heard someone say, okay, the school heard about this and they decided not to take action because of XYZ. Okay, the school, like, I hope that is out there, but I have yet to hear it. And reading things like that or hearing the things I'm getting in a couple DMs or the parent that we're talking hopefully later this weekend, it does sound like a toxic kind of culture, and that is problematic. And I know that, frankly, like my softball stuff, and I talked about it a couple times this week, hasn't always gotten the clicks. Again, I mentioned on, I think it was Thursday's episode, like I can see when users stop watching. So you probably all stopped watching about 20 minutes into this one when I stopped talking about basketball or whatever. But I don't think the story's going away, and I don't think it should. I think that if the school feels like they're making the right decision and keeping things going forward the way they are, I think people deserve an explanation as to why. And if they can't explain why, then maybe they shouldn't. And I'm going to keep mentioning it. I'd like to keep talking about it. I'd like to keep the conversation going. I'd also like to talk about other things. So if you want to talk about Houston sports in other ways, the NBA final, I'm a big basketball person. You want to talk about the NBA finals or what have you, you can find me at Painsworth512, PAINSWORTH 512 on all your social media handles. Happy to talk about all things Houston Cougars and more. I remember this, Locked On Cougs, your first listen each and every day. Locked On Cougs is a prime member of the Locked On Podcast Network. That means your team, our Houston Cougars, every day. Go Cougs.